All right. Hi, everybody. Before I get very started, I'll ask if anybody has any questions before I get going with a couple of announcements and chapter 4. Anybody have any questions? Several of you on the screen aced the test, did a great job. Macy, rock star. I don't remember if anybody else did a great job or not. I remember Macy did. I think you got a perfect score. It's amazing.
Yes, ma'am.
We had 2 or 3 of those perfect scores, and then some really high 90s as well. So really good scores for the most part. Bunch of 80s and 90s on the test. So that means you're reading your chapter and chapters and maybe watching the webinars and getting something out of the class. I hope so anyway. That's a good thing. So if you don't have any questions, we'll go ahead and dive in then. A couple of things I want to talk about before I begin talking about chapter 4. The first thing is the application activity that goes along with unit 1. And I haven't looked to see if anybody's actually turned that in yet, but I may give you an extra week on it because it actually requires a partner. And it says on the schedule that it's due. When is the 13th? That's not, is that this weekend? The 13th?
Yes, it's this week.
That's Sunday?
Yes.
Or is that next week? Let me look at my calendar.
I'm pretty
That
sure
seems pretty soon.
Yeah, it's this Sunday.
If you're going to have to work with a partner. So the 13th, yeah, that's Sunday. I'm going to give you a few extra days to get that done, maybe till the middle of next week. So what I think I'll do is open up a discussion board through which you can find a partner. Some of you may already know one another really well and have a partner picked out. But if not, you need to find a partner and find somebody that you can work with. And you're going to put together a collaborative lesson plan. And I've got a couple of samples that are already posted on the unit 1 under application activity, but I'm going to show you those right now. I'm going to share my screen. And first of all, let's see. I'm going to show you the instructions for that activity. Let's see. Here it is. Nope, that's one of the samples. Let me go back. Okay, here. Nope, that's sample B. Sample A, sample B. Nope, that's not it. Well, let me just go to the actual activity on Canvas. Nope. Okay, is that showing up now? Y'all see an application activity unit 1?
No, ma'am.
I think you are. Okay, this should say, and this is what you have at the end of application, at the end of unit 1, you have this application activity, and we have one of these at the end of each unit. We've got 4 units, and at the end of each unit, we have an activity that hopefully applies the concepts that you've learned in that unit. And this is the one that goes with unit 1 that we've just completed and had our test for. You're to place yourself in the role of a general education teacher or a special education teacher, one or the other. And it doesn't matter which role you take, but the whole point is to apply those concepts that we've talked about as far as collaboration between the two is concerned. So you're to develop a learning objective in a content or specialty area. And I don't care what the area is that you want to make your lesson about. It doesn't matter at all. And it doesn't matter what level it is. It doesn't matter if it's for little ones or older ones, middle school, high school, preschool, it doesn't matter. Develop a lesson plan to teach the objective that includes a model of co-teaching. And that was one of the questions out of our chapter 3 on our test, was the different models of co-teaching. And most of you got that right. Your textbook describes 6 varied approaches to co-teaching. You may choose one of these as your model and then collaborate with a peer to accomplish this task, each of you assuming the role of general education teacher or special education teacher. And if you've not yet learned about lesson planning, that's okay. Find an existing lesson plan, and many are available on the internet. You can look, just browse the internet in general. You can look on Pinterest or some other venue and discuss how it might be modified to meet the needs of John, who we read about in our textbook, or other students with disabilities. There's a plan in your textbook. It's on page 74 of your book. And it's a good example of a collaborative lesson plan in which general education and special education teachers are working together to structure activities around an appropriate learning goal and objectives that support the student's IEP, or their individualized education plan. Use this as a guide to develop your own. Both members of your team must submit a final project or a final product to Canvas. Now, those should look exactly alike, but both people have to submit it. Designate the team member who has taken the general education role and the special education role in developing the plan. So I want you to work together. One person take each one of those roles and then collaborate to get a plan that would work for a student or a classroom to put together that lesson plan that you have in mind. And then I have a couple of samples that came out of a class, a year or 2 ago when we did this activity. And so I have those as sample A and sample B. So here is sample A, and these are on Canvas for you to look at. This first one is a 2nd grade plan. And you can see how the students put it together. They listed the age of the students as 7 or 8 year olds. The student is identified. The students will identify the stages of the plant life cycle. And then the disability that they're focusing on is attention deficit disorder. And then they labeled the TEKS that they would be looking at. And then they wrote what the IEP objective is. Look, they chose my name as the child with a disability. They talked about instructional grouping, which teacher would have which role. It looks like in this group, there were 3 instructors. So we must have had an odd number in our group that year. And we had 3 people working together in this one, and they each took a role. One was the general ed teacher, one was the paraprofessional, or the teacher's aide, might be a more familiar term to you. And then one was the special ed teacher. And each one had a role. You can see how they put that together. They've got their sources that they used here. And then the actual worksheet that they would use in that lesson. So that's one example. And like I say, this is posted on Canvas for you to look at. And then let's look at sample B. Sample B looks a little different. Oops, that looks like the same one. Maybe I showed you, no, that's sample A. Sample B. Okay, here's sample B. This was a first grade objective, and the co-teaching method, you can see it looks a little bit different from the other one. The method that they used was one teach and one assist. They named their TEKs that were being addressed, and the IEP objective for Katie, who has dyslexia. The lesson objective, the materials needed, and you see they put theirs together completely differently. They used a chart as part of their the piece that they turned in here. They've got their lesson cycle components, how much time, and that's not a requirement. It's just the way these students decided to illustrate the lesson that they put together. And then the worksheet that they would use for their student. So a couple of examples of how they would work together to modify a lesson for a student with a disability, one working for the general ed side of the equation and the other working for special education. So that's the first thing that I want you to focus on. Like I said, I'll open up a discussion board for you to try to link up with a partner. So you can, say, hey, I'm Macy and I need a partner. And Lindsay can say, hey, I'm Lindsay, I need a partner too. And y'all could hook up something like that, or however that works to help people make connections. You don't have to use the discussion board to make your connections. If you already know somebody, you could do that, on your own through text messaging or some other venue if you've got that set up already to communicate with each other. But if you don't have those communication avenues to link up with each other, you can certainly use the discussion board to do that. So now, if you don't have any questions about that, we'll dive into chapter 4. Anybody have any questions about application activity 1? Anybody? Okay. Then let's talk a little bit about learning disabilities. This is chapter 4 in your book. And learning disabilities are something that are very, very common in our school setting. So the first thing we want to talk about is what a learning disability is and what it isn't. A learning disability is not a student who is a slow learner, a student who has a low IQ and low achievement. A student with a learning disability is a student who has the capability, we would expect for them to have the capability to learn, but for some reason, there's this unexpected lack of achievement in academic areas. So people like me who are educational diagnosticians do assessments of students in school. We give IQ tests and achievement tests, and we make determinations about what's going on with students, what's happening with them intellectually, and what's happening academically in the classroom setting. And a student with a learning disability is someone who has a typical or an average or a normal IQ profile. Their cognition, their thinking ability is where we would expect it to be for someone their age. But their achievement in academics is not. So we have this unexpected lack of achievement in a particular area of achievement in school. This is the most common disability that we find in our public school setting. It's larger than kids with ADD or ADHD. It's larger than kids with autism. It's a larger group than kids with intellectual disabilities or physical disabilities or any other disability that we're going to study this semester, the largest group. So if you're planning on being a teacher, you will definitely have kids with learning disabilities in your classrooms. If you're planning on working in a daycare setting or in any kind of a setting where you're going to work with children, you will definitely work with children who have learning disabilities. Usually we have a student or two with learning disabilities in these classes that we teach at the university. If you have dyslexia or have ever been identified as having dyslexia in your younger years in your school career, then you have a learning disability. We've been kind of hesitant to call dyslexia a learning disability, but it definitely is. It's a reading disability, and reading disabilities are learning disabilities. Math disabilities are learning disabilities. Writing disabilities are learning disabilities. All of those fall under the category of what we call specific learning disabilities. They occur in one of the specific areas of academics. And all of those students who have those identified learning disabilities have typical or normal intelligence, but for some reason or another, there's something going on that keeps them from learning in a typical way. And so there's a gap between their intelligence and their achievement in school subjects. So like I said, it's not kids who have low IQ and low achievement. It's kids who have high or normal IQ and lower achievement, usually in a specific area, sometimes in just one area of academics. Again, it's the most prevalent of all disabilities. About 4% of our school population has some kind of a learning disability. But what are the causes? Well, there are lots of causes, as you'll learn in your textbook. Some of them are neurological, something that's going on with the brain. Some of them are genetic. Oftentimes, particularly if we're talking about students with dyslexia, a reading disability, we'll see that that runs in families. Sometimes we have parents who have dyslexia and then kids who have dyslexia. Or we'll have siblings who, several siblings in a family who have difficulty learning to read. So it does often show up in genetics. Sometimes it's environmental. We'll see that students who have issues in the prenatal phase of life often then have difficulty with learning disabilities later on. Premature babies, sometimes babies who have issues in the birthing process or issues immediately postnatal, right after birth. Sometimes those children have learning disabilities. So we don't have a single cause. We've got lots of different causes. So what is the history of learning disabilities? We haven't always called them learning disabilities. We really have a foundational phase that began back in the 1800s and grew on into the early part of the 20th century with brain research. When scientists began to look at the brain and its development, and we began to see that things were going on with people who had gaps in their learning, and things were different with their brains. And your textbook does talk about this. We have a period of time that was then called the transitional phase in the history of learning disabilities, where scientists and researchers began to apply some of that research. This was generally the period between about 1930 and 1960, when that term learning disabilities began to take shape and take form. And we began to see that there was a subset of students in our schools who actually had difficulty in a very specific kind of way with their learning. And then we have this integration phase that began there in the early 60s and went up through the mid 1970s, where the term learning disability became an identifiable area of its own in education. And we actually made it a label of its own and began identifying students as having learning disabilities. And then the current phase actually began formally in 1975 when special education came into existence, and we began identifying students as having learning disabilities and serving them in public school settings in 1975. And then focusing on strategies and supports that we could give those students to help make learning more approachable for those students. So here's our definition. This is what it actually looks like in the law and has since 1975, which is quite a lengthy period of time now. The definition reads this way: specific learning disability means a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding and using language, spoken or written, that may manifest itself in an imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. And you'll notice those are all the things we have to do in school, including conditions such as perceptual disabilities, brain injury, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, and developmental aphasia. Disorders not included, specific learning disability does not include learning problems that are primarily the result of visual, hearing, or motor disabilities, of intellectual disability, of emotional disturbance, or of environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantage. So that second bullet tells us all the things that we have to rule out in order to say that a child has a specific learning disability. It can't be the primary cause of, or it can't be primarily caused by a vision, hearing, or motor problem. It can't be caused by an intellectual disability, or what we used to call mental retardation. It can't be caused primarily by emotional disturbance, or because of a lack of advantage in socioeconomic conditions, cultural issues, or environmental conditions. And so we have to rule all those things out before that we can say that a child has a specific learning disability. So we've got these areas that we divide specific learning disabilities into: reading, writing, math, and oral language. And so we parcel learning disabilities into those areas that we use in school. The most common, as you might expect, is learning disabilities in the area of reading. Most children with learning disabilities have them in reading. About 90% of all kids who have learning disabilities have them in reading. And we can divide those out into some specific areas. One of those is phonological awareness, what you might know as, phonics. Can a child tell you the sounds of the letters, what the sounds are when you put some of them together? If you had a strong phonics background when you were learning to read, and this would be, learning what the sound that each letter makes, and then learning about blends, that when BR goes together, it says brr. When CL goes together, it says cl. TH is a diphthong. When it goes together, it says th and ch and sh. A strong phonics background teaches phonological awareness. Kids who have learning disabilities in the area of reading have a very difficult time with that part of the reading process, remembering all those sounds and which letters make which sounds. And when two letters go together, the sound that they make when they go together. Kids who have difficulty in this area, if they saw a TH in a word, they wouldn't remember that the TH makes a th sound. They would try to make the t and the h sound separately rather than putting those sounds together. Rapid automatic naming, we call this RAN. And this is that process of of quickly being able to recognize sounds and fire them off fast. And that's part of skill in reading, being able to quickly respond to what you're seeing, let that process through the brain, and then have output orally. Word recognition, seeing whole words and being able to remember what the whole word is. Once you learn some of those phonics, you can just remember the whole word and not have to sound it out anymore. And then reading comprehension, what you do with the words and the sentences once you put them together. Are you able to get meaning from those words in paragraph form, in story form, and derive meaning and make sense from what you've read? Then we have the area of math. About 25% of our learning disabilities are in the area of math. Now, a student can have a disability in the area of reading and in math. That can happen. But certainly reading has a much higher loading than our math area. We have several areas in math where our kids have difficulty. One area is calculation. That's just kind of the basics, the nuts and bolts of math, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, telling time, counting money, numeration, knowing, what the letters, what the numbers actually mean, what they stand for, some of those kind of things. Knowledge of basic math facts, learning your times tables, learning your addition facts, understanding of math concepts, what a greater than and less than actually mean, some of those things that are a little more abstract. And then problem solving skills. What do you do with those facts once you've got them? Can you make sense of them when you put them into a problem, into problem solving? If you need to put the if the recipe calls for baking the cake for an hour and a half, and you put it in the oven at 5:30, what time do you need to take it out? That kind of thing, some basic problem solving. Now, written expression is a little more maybe a little less clear cut, because there are some areas that we look at and some that we don't. It would seem obvious that we would want to look at handwriting, but handwriting is really not something that we quantify in written expression. We're looking more at the quality of the writing that a student does more than what it looks like on paper. So we usually don't look at handwriting, and we don't look at spelling. Sometimes we don't look at things like capitalization and punctuation. We're looking more at the quality of what a child puts on paper. So what kind of vocabulary they're using, how do they organize their thoughts? Can they put together a paragraph with a theme in it? So the things that if you've taken the STAR test when you were coming up through school, the things that the evaluators of that test are looking for on the writing portion, those thematic elements. Can you put together a good paragraph, not looking so much at the nuts and bolts of writing, but more at the qualitative aspects? Can you put together a paragraph that makes sense? Can you get a message across to a reader? Some of those kinds of things. And then in the area of oral language, we have two areas that we look at. We look at the expressive side of language and the receptive side. Expressive is the output of oral language. So how I speak to you, the words that I choose to use, can I get my words out? And then receptive is my listening skill. What am I understanding that's being spoken to me? Am I able to understand words, paragraphs, sentences that are being spoken to me, and can I get meaning from that? So can I express myself orally, and can I understand what's being spoken to me? So there's another area that we measure it and then compare it to academics. And that's what we call cognition. We might call that intelligence or IQ. You may have been given an IQ test at some point in your life. And if so, that's what cognition is. It's the way that a person thinks. How well do you pay attention? What kind of memory skills do you have? What kind of strategies do you use to problem solve? And then there's this word called metacognition. And that means, how do you think about thinking? How do you organize the way that you think, or are your thoughts more chaotic and scattered? I think you all probably know, since I've had some difficulty getting this class started this semester, that my mother has just had a series of strokes. And as such, it's been very interesting to me to watch her cognition really suffer as she's had damage to her brain. I've tested probably thousands of people in my career as an educational diagnostician with intelligence tests, with IQ tests. And I've tested a number of people who have traumatic brain injuries. I've tested a lot of children who have intellectual disabilities. But to watch someone who has suffered a stroke or a series of strokes as they lose some of that thinking ability that they've had is, it's a really sad thing to watch, but it's also a fascinating thing to watch, as my mother struggles to find words that she has known forever, and then sometimes inserts other words in their place. Memory has gaps in it. Her cognition is certainly suffering, but the way the brain works and how it attempts to rejuvenate is truly amazing. She said to me a couple of nights ago that she was hurting. She was in pain. And I said, what's hurting? Tell me where your pain is. And she said, email. And then she looked at me like, what just came out of my mouth? And I said, email. She said, yes. And I said, well, email doesn't hurt. She said, yes, email. And it was like she couldn't get another word out. She wanted to, but the only word that would come to her lips was email. And she got very frustrated trying to tell me what part of her body was hurting. And the only word that she could come up with was email. So the brain is a very complex organ of the body that can play tricks on us when it's damaged. So the ways that we identify learning disabilities, we have a couple of different methods that we use in schools. One is called response to intervention. And if you've spent any time in schools lately, you will have heard of what we call RTI. And you all are about to go out, particularly if you're an education major, you're going to go out and get into the schools here in the next few days. And you will see some of this in schools. You may even want to ask your cooperating teacher about the response to intervention program that they have in their school, because every school has one these days. It's an avenue for leading to the identification of disabilities. So when students start having trouble in school, they will be placed in a response to intervention program. And it's usually a tiered program in which students begin with a low level of intervention. And they'll receive some assistance initially with whatever the problem is that they're having. And if they don't respond to that intervention, then they'll go up to the next tier and they'll get a more intensive level of intervention. They'll have more frequent help with whatever the problem is that they're having, more intensive help with that problem. And then if they continue not to respond to that intervention, they'll go up to the next tier and they'll be pulled out of class more, and they'll get more intensive intervention, more intensive instruction. And this is that tiered model of response to intervention for kids who are having difficulty in school. That's one way to identify learning disabilities. Another way to identify learning disabilities is through what we call standardized testing or assessment. And that's where we have somebody like me who works in the schools called an educational diagnostician or a school psychologist who will come in and do a formal evaluation with the student and take the child and do an IQ assessment, and then do some assessments with achievement tests and test their math skills and their reading skills and their writing and listening skills, and see how all of that comes together and compare those scores. And if there is enough difference between what we would expect their achievement to be according to their IQ and what their actual achievement is, then that child may be determined to have a learning disability. So how do we teach kids who have learning disabilities? Well, your textbook talks about different approaches to content. You can find those on page 102. There's some instructional procedures that are discussed on page 106. And then how we can change the instructional environment is discussed on page 114. If you look in your book on 102, where we talk about approaches to content, there are a lot of different kinds of approaches to content for students with learning disabilities. Sometimes the right thing to do is to break the content down into smaller pieces. Sometimes we need to just take the general curriculum and parcel it down into smaller content chunks. And that can be a good approach to the content. We always want to try to keep the child as close to their grade level instruction as possible. What we used to do in the old days is we would take a child way back to a lower grade level and try to give all of our instruction at a lower grade level and gradually raise them back up to the grade level that they're currently in. But we found that that wasn't always a very effective procedure, because oftentimes we would get stuck if a child was in the 4th grade and he was reading at a 1st grade level. Well, we'd take him all the way back to the 1st grade level, and he was achieving at such a slow rate that by the time his classmates were in the 5th grade, he was only at the 1st grade 6th month. And then by the time his classmates were in the 6th grade, he was only at the 2nd grade level. And by the time his classmates were in the 7th grade, he was only at the 2nd grade 5th month. And as you can see, the margin between this student and his classmates is just getting wider and wider and wider. So we've sort of shifted the way we think about our approach to content. And our idea is to give students strategies to access the curriculum at their grade level with measures that will help them keep up, rather than starting way back at the beginning and trying to give all of that content. We try to fill in the gaps of their learning rather than starting way back at the beginning. Your book will talk about some of these approaches to content, some instructional procedures that are used, and the best instructional environments in which to teach students. We also used to always pull kids out of the general environment, the general education environment, and put them down the hall in a special education classroom. We've also determined through time that that's not the best approach either. The best approach is to keep kids in general education as much as possible. So if you're planning to be a general education teacher, you will have students with learning disabilities in your classroom, because we don't take kids out very much anymore and put them down the hall in a special education classroom. In fact, even kids with really significant disabilities are oftentimes in the general education classroom much of the day, if not all of the day. And so We've got kids with disabilities in class more and more all the time with their typically developing peers. So that's my last slide. Any questions about what we just talked about? Anybody? Okay. I also want to mention tonight that I do have the list of your placements. And what I plan to do when we finish up here tonight is to email each individual your placement, and let you go ahead and get started with those. If you are an education major, you have a placement that's coming to you. If you are not, you do have to self-place. I've talked to you a little bit about that through the course, about how you do that. If you are a child and family studies major, your folks in your department, I think, are willing to help you with that placement opportunity. If you are a secondary major and your content specific, maybe math or science or music or whatever it might be, I think your professors in those areas can probably help you as well. If you have another area of expertise that you're looking at, you may want to talk to your professors in those content areas. And if you're really stuck, give me a call and we'll see what we can do. Let's see. What else? Any other questions?
I
I'm
have
gonna
a
open up a
question.
discussion board about finding a partner. I will extend that due date a little bit longer so you can have a little more time to work with somebody. I may go ahead and stretch it to the next weekend, okay? So you
I
have,
have a question, Miss Calvin.
I can't hear you, Macy.
Hear me now?
Turn your volume up.
Should work.
I'm not hearing you at all. And you're not on mute,
Let me see.
but I'm not hearing you.
No, it's not. It's not on mute.
Maybe just write me something in the chat. Okay, just message me then. That'd be great. All right. If we don't have any other questions, then I guess we'll call it a night, and it's 7:45.
I do have a
Okay.
question. Can you hear
No
me?
questions?
No, can you hear me? Hello?
All right. Thank you all for attending tonight. And I'll see you online. All righty. Thanks, folks.